Welcome to the STEAM Success Blueprint. We're so glad you're tuning in. We're happy to have you as a listener and as someone who is gleaning insight from this leader in her field. Sonya Weigle is our guest today, and this episode is co-hosted by Chadwin Hanna, who is a MD PhD student at the University of Florida. I'm a PharmD candidate at Howard University, College of Pharmacy. It's so good to have you with us today as a guest. Please note the views of this podcast represent those of my guests and I. These do not constitute in any way, shape, or form medical advice or professional advice or consultation or suggestions. We disclaim any loss in any way. Thank you again for listening, and we hope you are inspired and encouraged to make the positive impact that the world needs and requires of us as productive social citizens. Thank you again. Welcome to the STEAM Success Blueprint. We are so glad you are listening in. Today we have with us a special guest, Sonya Weigle. Sonya Weigle is a senior executive and strategic advisor in the life sciences and biotech industry, known for her expertise in leadership development, innovation strategy, and organizational transformation. Her work sits at the intersection of science, business, and leadership, helping organizations move from complexity to clarity. As a speaker, Sonya is valued for her clear insights, grounded perspective, and ability to translate complex challenges into actionable strengths and strategies. Her talks resonate with leaders seeking to build resilient teams, drive innovation responsibly, and lead with confidence in rapidly evolving environments. Sonya, it's so good to have you with me today as a guest. Thank you again for reaching out. It's definitely an honor to have you with me today. So as we begin, what led you? Also, this episode hosted by my buddy Chadwin Hanna, MD PhD student at UF. So what led you to do the work that you're doing now? And what keeps you going? What drives you in the work that you're doing?
Well, I love the biotech industry specifically, but the life sciences industry broadly. I've been in this industry since I got out of graduate school back in 1995. Starting with global consulting and then eventually starting my own consultancy in this space, focused on merger and acquisition integration in the life sciences. But where I've found myself these last several years is in biotech, particularly in rare disease and early drug development. And I'm deeply committed to early drug development and being part of the innovation ecosystem that brings new drug therapies to patients that desperately need it. What I love about biotech in particular is the access to the patient that you get. With larger pharma, you're perhaps, more separated from that impact. But, I have found, particularly working in rare disease, you get to know the patients, you get to know their families, their caregivers, and you really do understand and feel the impact that you can have with this kind of work. Not being a scientist myself, I'm not in the lab, but if I can help to upskill and create environments where those the folks that are developing these therapies can operate at their highest and best use, that's really what motivates me.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I'll bounce off to Chadwin.
Yeah, thank you, Sonya. It's such a pleasure to meet you and be interviewing you today. My question in response to that was did you have a moment where you were like, this is exactly what I want to do for the rest of my life? At what point did the biotech industry, and specifically being a leader and an executive, click to you and say, this is what I want to do?
I again looked at it sort of from the business side of things, but when I joined Marinus Pharmaceuticals back in January of 2020, that was my first experience with a rare disease company, and with a company that was moving from the clinic with a successful phase 3 into now the opportunity to commercialize their drug. And, it's a very, very small patient population. And so when you look at it broadly from a business standpoint, that's not necessarily what moves the needle with investors and other things, right? But this was a situation where you're looking at very small children who are extraordinarily sick and who have a quality of life that not only is impacting them, but their families and their caregivers. And here I now was part of an organization that, even though it's a very, very small population of people, our drug measurably and significantly increased their quality of life. Seeing that in real time, in real life, just cemented for me that, this is so much bigger than the business behind it, which of course is necessary and needed in order to underwrite these tremendous breakthroughs and this innovation. But when you see it on the face of the patient and the family, and you meet them at the beginning of the trial, and then they're on drug and it's in the market, and then you see them again, and it's just really you realize how important that work is.
Yes, sounds good. Sounds good. So when you're helping an organization move from complexity to clarity, what is the first milestone you usually have to pass through between the scientific founders and the business executives? Or another way to put that would be, what would be the first barrier you usually have to break down between the scientific founders and the business executives?
Yeah, so it really comes down to organizational culture, values. So, what often makes you very successful in the lab, and that is, an intense focus on the science and progression and achievement in that regard, can look very different when you bring in a commercial organization and you bring in a sales force, and now, your metrics and your milestones are associated with, the sale of the drug, right? And the sustainability of the company, and making it something that's market compatible and market attractive. And so the big milestone has been, hey, is this organization ready for the onslaught of what being a commercial organization means? How do we transform this very successful R&D, clinically focused organization into one that can now take that drug and put it onto the marketplace? And so, where I found that intersection can be very difficult, it quite often is, because it's almost a tissue rejection that can happen at times, because it's like, well, wait, we're in the lab, we're doing the important work, we created this drug, absolutely. But then you've got to turn it over and you've got to put it in the bag of the sales force who's going to take it and sell it. And that's a different milestone, right? It's a different level of achievement. And sometimes it's a hard road to get the two to kind of see the value in one another and in a cohesive enough way to kind of grow sustainably together. So it really comes down to, but what is our true north and our united vision for success? And that always comes down to patient outcomes and the patient experience. And that's where that unity can be found. That's why we're here, right? And so, but it takes a lot of work, right? That's easily said, but not easily done. And, it often just demonstrates a different level of evolution in the company, not better, just bigger and different. And we have to prepare for that well in advance.
Okay, sounds good. I'll bounce off to Chadwin.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I was a senior research and development engineer in a large med tech company, and I've now recently shifted over into the startup atmosphere, and it's completely different going from somewhere where these systems exist. There's a play-by-play rule book on how to get things done, how to get from innovation to FDA to affecting patients' lives. And being in a startup is just hard. It feels like the space to fill is just too large at some point. So have you ever interacted with a startup or R&D founders and had to tell them, like, you guys aren't ready, you need to do some more work?
Sure.
It's too large of a gap here.
Yeah, it starts with recognizing that there is a gap, right? And so that's executive leadership. That's often the CEO or the founder, the board of directors, who are quite often also the investors, recognizing, hey, we see that there's a gap, but, they don't necessarily know what to do about it. But, when there is a gap, and that's a very natural thing to happen, right? It's almost expected. And so, that's when you really do the work to pull back and say, okay, what does success mean like for this drug? What does success look like for these patients? What does success look like for this company? What does success look like for our external shareholders? The not only the current investors, but that next round investors that we're going to need to bring in order to scale the company. You really have to have, as leadership, your eye on all of those stakeholder groups, and with that, kind of define what is the culture that's going to get there. What do we value? What does success look like here? How do we get all of our employees, regardless of the role that they play, whether they're in R&D, whether they are in the G&A group, finance, or whatever, whether or not they are coming on at some point in a commercial part of the commercial organization, what do we all know to be true in terms of how we operate and what value is here? Are we consensus driven, or do we like to move quickly? Are we focused on internal business acumen, and that drives what we're doing? Are we strategic focused? I mean, what are those cultural imperatives? And then what are the things that as a small startup have made us successful so far that we know regardless of how big we get, those things have to remain? And what I often hear is words like communication and collaboration, the kinds of things that got us here that'll make us successful. We want to make sure we hold on to those in some level. They may look different at that next stage, but it's what got us here. We want to honor that.
That sounds
culture,
good.
right? That's like the definition of culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Yes. It's very good. Very good. So I have a question. Part of your mission here in the STEAM Success Blueprint is closing the gap. From your vantage point, how does having a diverse leadership team specifically impact quality of innovation and strategy in a life sciences company? Do you think there is a tangible diversity dividend that you've observed?
100%. Now, this is absolutely critical, and it starts with having the right voices and the right representation in all of the rooms. So it's not even the right rooms. Each room is the right room. And when we look at healthcare disparity, when we look at the history of healthcare in our country and how it's administered, when we look at clinical trials and the opportunities to not just participate in them, but to know that they exist, right? When we look at disease states that impact certain populations that don't impact others, where are we opening up opportunities to bring those voices to the table, to impact those patient populations that are underrepresented and underserved? How are we getting these trials out to people who aren't necessarily sitting in city centers, for example? How are we doing that? And that starts with having a diverse leadership and then cascading that through the organization. That diversity has to be present all the way through, not only so that the patient voice is represented accurately, effectively, and with maximum impact when it comes to clinical trial design, when it comes to our commercial strategy, when it comes to how we design the way that we operate as an organization, but also in our day-to-day ways of working. Super important, because those diverse perspectives are going to allow for a richer, more vibrant approach to every area of the business, right? When you do things in a vacuum, or you do things with a homogenous point of view, you really, not only do you miss out on opportunity, but it creates holes through which strategic disadvantage lives, right? So you're not able to see or even understand opportunities because you don't have that perspective. When you have all of the different perspectives in the room, that's what really provides, to me, a market differentiator from a business perspective, but a clinical trial design and execution perspective from the scientific side of things.
Wow, that's very good. Go ahead, Chadwin.
No, I just wanted to piggyback on that. That a lot of people don't realize in regards to healthcare disparity, it's from top to bottom, right? And clinical trials are one of those huge things. African American populations and people of color in general are extremely disparate in clinical trials. And when you have the whole point of a clinical trial is to get this drug out to as much of the population of people who are going to be using it as necessary. So having disparities, it goes against the whole point of the clinical trial.
Absolutely.
how have you and the teams and companies that you've worked with specifically actioned ensuring that you aren't creating a disparity or solving disparities in your clinical trial designs with these new drugs?
So, I've not specifically been involved in clinical trial design, right? Because I'm not on the scientific side, but what I have been able to participate in is on the patient advocacy side, partnering with patient advocacy groups through our corporate affairs functions to make sure that, we're bringing advocacy groups into the fold and they can help us with everything from, trial design to, site selection to, getting that advocacy partnership together. So, it's about identifying the right organizations in the communities we know we want to reach. It's about working with the advocacy groups to even identify who those communities are to make sure that they're part of it. And, what I can do from the business side is encourage just the development of a culture that says this is what we value. We understand that this is important. So that is going to inform all of those decisions even before we get started.
Okay. Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, today is Martin Luther King Day. So we honor and reflect the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and his powerful dream that he had for America. So I ask you today, Sonya, what dreams do you have for the biotech industry in terms of equity and representation and justice and opportunity for those trying to get into the industry? What dreams or aspirations or goals are you working towards now?
What an amazing question. Thank you for that. And I think I'll start with what drew me to your podcast to begin with. I think it's part of the answer to that question. So not only am I deeply committed to early drug development, but I am fiercely committed to building a pipeline of talent into the biotech industry that represents all patients, all voices, and creating opportunities where perhaps they weren't before. If I'm able to use any of my influence to open up those doors to make sure we have that representation, I think that would be part of the dream that I have for the biotech industry. More broadly speaking, I very much hope that the biotech industry can begin to have a legislative relationship with governing bodies that not only opens the door for more biotech innovation, but more recognition in that innovation of healthcare disparity and inequities. So those two things for me go hand in hand. And early stage drug development in biotech is very different from big pharma and large pharma. I was privileged to spend some time on the Hill last fall and met with 20 different legislators in both the Senate and the congressional side with a group of other biotech CEOs. And we were able to have really meaningful discussion on why biotech needs to be protected at all costs and why, legislative battles about drug pricing and, where we manufacture drugs, that's a big pharma issue. We don't sell drugs in biotech, right? We build drugs in biotech, and by doing things that curb funding and investment and non-dilutive early stage funding to biotech severely hampers our ability to underwrite the development of drugs on an early stage. And so I think, for my dream for biotech would be for it to be viewed as the innovation factor that it is, as opposed to being sort of wiped with that just broad pharma brush, right? We need to develop the drugs at the very early stages in a way that is not hampered by funding, access to capital, and access to a pipeline of diverse talent, right? If we can solve the funding thing and take that away as a barrier, that means young folks, particularly young folks of color, who are interested in getting into the sciences and into STEAM and into biotech and medtech and all of those places, creating a solid, secure, sustainable biotech industry. So that is an industry that's attractive to the biggest and brightest brains in STEAM amongst underrepresented kids. That's solidifying that pipeline, solidifies the entire industry. And that's what I would love to see.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sonya and Chadwin, for joining me today. It was so good to have you all on today as guests.
It was wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.